Welcome back, everybody, to our lessons in the study of existentialism. This will be our final lesson, specifically on the subject of Friedrich Nietzsche, focusing on this idea of man and power and man and Superman, as taken from the John Bernard Shaw play. We'll discuss the ways in which Friedrich Nietzsche has been misconstrued, misinterpreted in some circles and in some areas. But mainly be focusing on this idea with reference to and through the lens of existentialism. I want to remind you all that this is a series of lessons, not specifically on the philosophy of Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or Heidegger, who is going to be our next topic. This is a series of lessons on this idea of existentialism as a movement within philosophy, rather than a specific school of philosophy itself, but as a movement within philosophy that seems to have gripped a number of different thinkers in and around a similar time period, from sort of Kierkegaard through to Nietzsche and into Heidegger, and then into some of the later philosophers, people like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. So all of which are going to be discussed, of course, and we will be finishing our lessons here looking at the concept of man and power through the lens of an existentialist framework. Fundamentally, this is considerably seen as one of the most controversial elements of Nietzschean philosophy, not necessarily because of what Nietzsche says, but more the implications of this theory and this philosophy post Friedrich Nietzsche. This lesson will primarily focus on the concept that is known as the will to power, and how this ties into broader theories of selfhood, personhood, and then by extension of that, of course, how it feeds into broader theories relating to meaning and the search for meaning, taking the language from Viktor Frankl there. Of course, this is a part of the existentialist framework. So, let's think about this. The idea of existentialism and selfhood and personhood, and the idea of the self. Now, we have got a few lessons already that we have discussed looking at the concept of personhood and the philosophy of personhood and what it means to be a person. But this whole series of lessons specifically, of course, has been discussing the nature of meaning, the concept of meaning within life. And for Nietzsche, meaning is the response to the nihilistic, self-centered constructs of human life. And it is in this philosophical foundation that we can actually derive out of that the theoretical concept of the Übermensch. If we look here and citing Khattab, the textbooks that we're going to cite at the end of this this lesson particularly, quote, "The Übermensch should not be taken as the promise of a higher progressive type of human being, but as more an anonymous structural concept that prepares the possibility of life affirmation." So the concept of the Übermensch is something that is described by Nietzsche relatively limitedly, in a relatively limited concept, in a relatively limited confines. But fundamentally, it is something that is referenced. And it is important to remember that the concept itself of the Übermensch, of this idea of a superhuman, is not something to do with some kind of Darwinian social Darwinism, evolutionary possibility, or the idea of there existing some kind of higher man. And as I've mentioned before, there is of course the distinction that is made and the dichotomy that is alluded to between man and Superman. This is of course something that is taken from the John Bernard Shaw play. That is not exactly what Nietzsche is getting to when he talks about the concept of the Übermensch. The idea here of improvement of humanity is not something that Nietzsche is even necessarily convinced himself by, and there is therefore a distinction that is made between those who seek to aspire, and as a result of which have attached the notion of the higher person, compared to those who do not. The difference for Nietzsche that we can think about here is in relation to a concept which is a little bit more important, at least in terms of our conceptualizations of Nietzschean philosophy, and specifically looking at it through the lens of existentialism, this idea of the will to power. The will to power being something that has to really be read alongside this concept of the Übermensch in order to really get a better understanding of what it seems to be the case that Nietzsche is trying to get at. So, fundamentally, Okay, the most important of this theory is the word power. Because Nietzsche conceives power not necessarily in the sense that we would conceive of power today, in a kind of highly political sense, the concept of power and the taking of power in the sense of politicians, for example, not in the kind of geopolitical or international relations kind of sense, in the view of power as conceived by sovereignty and conceived by the power of influence within states, or even the concept of power from the perspective of natural sciences, the physics and the concept of power as being a thing that can be defined by equation. Instead, Nietzsche conceives of power as, quote, creativity or imagination, as taken from Solomon at page 48. The will to power specifically is therefore a motivation, since humans have an inherent desire for power, for creativity, for imagination. And it is this will to power, this desire for power, that can be contrasted with desires for some other kind of pleasures, such as, for example, hedonistic pleasures, as elucidated in some contemporary theories of normative ethics. One example, of course, of the sort of concept of hedonistic pleasures and hedonism can be seen in the writings and the philosophies of people like Jeremy Bentham, who conceived of the concept of a theory of normative ethics as being one that is constructed around this concept of the principle of utility. The principle of utility for different philosophers throughout history has meant different things. But for Bentham, the concept of utility was deriving and the creation and the maximization of this concept of pleasure, of course being quite hedonistic in that conceptualization. This also factors into the writings of other normative ethicists and utilitarians, people like, for example, John Stuart Mill, who wrote in favour of theories of utilitarianism, but instead recognised the existence of higher and lower pleasures rather than adopting a mere hedonistic understanding and encapsulation of utilitarianism, something which, of course, Bentham goes about doing. So, given all of these conceptions, the will to power itself is a conceptualization that many philosophers believe is taken from previous philosophy, taken specifically from Schopenhauer, because the concept of the will to power is something that is sort of conceived of within the writings of Schopenhauer, but there is a major distinction, okay? Because when we look at the concept of will, the concept of the will within Schopenhauer's philosophy, something that we're not going to get into in much detail in this series, but I'm sure we will talk about Schopenhauer in the future. Schopenhauer was one of my least favourite philosophers to study when I was an undergraduate, by the way, but I'm sure I'll get around to studying Schopenhauer in the future. Anyway, the concept of the will when we talk about the philosophy of Schopenhauer is a theory which is and has this idea of metaphysical force. But for Nietzsche and the Nietzschean conception of the will to power, we actually see a rejection of metaphysical conceptions. So what Nietzsche is essentially doing here is capturing some of the basic ideas that are presented by Schopenhauer with relation to the will, the concept of will, and merging it with his own rejection of metaphysics. And so we get this kind of non-metaphysical conception of a Schopenhauer-esque theory within the concept of the will. And this is really where we get this idea of a Nietzschean a novelty within the Nietzschean philosophy at this particular point. And this is really an interesting point when we talk about the will to power, because the will to power is therefore considered as something that is very different to what you might ordinarily have understood the will to power to mean in ordinary language. The will to power referring instead to things like creativity and to imagination, rather than specifically to the concepts of power that we might conceptualize of today. In terms of writings that we have essentially been utilizing throughout this series of lessons, I've put here a series of citations and further readings for those of you who want to go into more detail. Now, fundamentally, I wanted to shy away from going through and adding citations and further readings specifically to the philosophers themselves. So you could, I could theoretically have linked and cited all the writings of Nietzsche and all of the academic third-party texts on Nietzsche, but instead I wanted to just focus as much as I can on the ways in which these philosophers can be viewed through the lens of existentialism. This is a series on existentialism, not necessarily a series on Kierkegaard or Dostoevsky or Sartre or Heidegger or Nietzsche. So that is why I've sort of limited the citations and further readings and the use of citations and further readings to these kinds of ideas. And with that being said, obviously, a short introduction to existentialism is a very good place to start. I really enjoyed the short introduction series, especially as somebody who wants to be something of a generalist when it comes to understanding concepts in the world. It's good to have the ability to have a basic understanding of a subject by reading a short book rather than having to read months of a large text. But more specifically and more in depth, Crowell's Cambridge Companion to Existentialism, a collection of essays on a variety of different philosophers and sources, is a really important source for you to get your hands on if you want to go into more detail on this reading, in addition to the two writings here by Kaufman and by Wicks that are cited in the further readings down below. If you like this video, please feel free to like it and to subscribe, and we will get more existentialism videos out to you in the coming weeks.